Second language acquisitions, what is it? Second language, also known as SLA, is a process of developing the ability to learn a second language. We're going to be using the terms and acronyms L1 and L2 in this presentation. L1 is representing your native tongue in which you learn as a child. L2 is representing the language learned after the primary language has been established. I'm also going to go over first the important terms to know throughout this presentation. Acquisition is the gradual development over time of the ability in a language by using it naturally to communicate in communicative situations with others who know that language. We're going to learn two terms, EFL and ESL. ESL, if you were born in the United States, English was your first language, you're probably more familiar with ESL, English as a second language, students in your school learning that. EFL is English as a foreign language. Second language learning is used to describe both EFL and ESL. Now, learning applies to more than a conscious process of accumulating knowledge through analysis of features of a language. But within second language acquisitions, we are going to focus on how we learn the second language. There are a few different methods that have developed over time. The primary being the grammar translation method, the audiolingual method, and lastly, the communicative approach. There has been a timeline. First, we used the grammatic translation method. Then we started using audiolingual method, and then on to communicative method. The grammar translation method is learning a language through learning the vocabulary list, the rules for that language, and memorization is often encouraged. The cons is it leaves the students very ignorant of how the language might actually be used on a day-to-day basis. An audiolingual method, we actually spent hours drilling in a lab, not a science lab, but the lab in a classroom, of learning sentences and phrases. The cons of this is isolation drilling in language patterns doesn't resemble a natural interaction in that second language. Then we have the communicative approach. It's actually the latest teaching style right now for second language acquisitions. It involves the belief that a language should function as a language, and that should be emphasized during the teaching process. Okay? This is also familiar. This is also similar with focus on the learner. Focusing on the learner, there's a couple things that we want to take notice here. Is when the learner starts, they went from focusing on the method of learning, like the book, the teacher, to focusing on how someone actually learns a second language. And that's this slide right here. We have transfer, positive transfer, negative transfer, interlanguage, and fossilize. And I'm going to go through each one of those terms in a second. Transfer means using sounds, expressions, or structures from your L1 when performing L2. Example, if I speak English and I'm learning Spanish, I may use some structure from English language when I'm trying to speak Spanish. Now that's transfer. So you have positive and negative transfer. So how can that positively be transferred? Transferring knowledge from L1 to L2 if they have a similarity. If I speak in English and there's a similar way that functions in Spanish, I transfer that over, and that's considered a positive transfer. I'm going to reference to transfer a little bit later in the presentation. A negative transfer is when L1 features that are really different from L2 may cause the L2 expression to be difficult to understand. What I mean is, if I speak English and there's a rule in English that I'm familiar with and I transfer to my Spanish, it may not make very much sense. It may confuse the person whom I'm speaking to. So negative transfer is using rules that don't apply to the language and thus confusing yourself and other people. Interlanguage is language produced by L2 learners that contains a large number of errors that seem to have no connection to either L1 or L2, which means now they're making up rules that have connection to neither language, which is called interlanguage. And interlanguage can also become fossilized. Fossilized is what we perceive as an accent. So when someone has a strong accent, that's what we conceive as fossilized. Now, this next part is very important. It talks about Van Patten is actually a linguistics professor that specifically talks about second language acquisition and how you learn it through input and output. He says that communication interactions where input need to be interpreted helps the learner group a better context of the language. And I'm going to play a brief video for you here.
Is that the language that grows in your head, what we call mental representation, may grow during communicative interactions. Now, why is that? Why would your mental representation grow if communication involves processes different from that? Well, that's because part of your interactions, part of your communicative interactions, include interpretation of meaning. And there should be a clue there to you, a hint of why mental representation might grow. That's because interpretation of meaning implies that you're being exposed to input as a learner. And if you're being exposed to input, that's input that you're interpreting for its meaning. So therefore, communicative interchanges contain input that might be useful to the learner that helps the language system grow over time.
So that's a primary example of why input is necessary to learn a second language. Learning that input, you have output is when you're speaking to someone. I'll give you a correct definition here in case you don't know what input or output means. The learner experiences the benefit of receiving input, which is when someone is talking to you, hearing the second language, hearing the L2, and producing output, speaking the L2, speaking the second language. The opportunity to produce comprehensive output in a meaningful interaction seems to be another important element in the learner's development of the second language. Okay, so that's what Mr. Van Patten emphasizes here is input and output in context, and how you're learning the second language is a big makes a big difference. Now,
and if the learner is working on,
let me go ahead and pause this. So my experience. So I took Spanish 1 and 2 in high school, and after graduating, I did not know how to speak Spanish. It wasn't until a few years later when I started practicing input and output in context social situations that I was actually able to learn the second language, learn the L2. That has been my experience, is exactly what they're talking about right here. And so I have a couple videos here on Van Patten and what he says about that.
In fact, there are some people who argue much more strongly than I that say it does nothing, right? It does not help with mental representation. It is not clear that it helps with skill development, which we're going to touch on in just a minute. So if we have our practice makes perfect mindset, what we want to do is kind of go, no, not really. That's really not how language develops. Okay, we're about to go on to point 3, so it's a good point for a question. Good for you.
So it's great because he talks about practice does not make perfect, and it's the fact that you have to learn in certain social contexts with input and output in order to learn that language. And that's what he's going to go ahead and emphasize in this next video here.
Lexicon and morphology. At the same time, the person's working on phonology. At the same time, the person is working on syntactic features and constraints on sentence formation. At the same time, the person is working on pragmatics and discourse. At the same time, the person is working on interfaces between all of these things. At the same time, the person is working on communicative competence. At the same time, the person is working on...
So what he emphasizes here is when you're learning a language, you're learning all these different parts of that second language. So if you had to just memorize all those things, it's going to be very difficult for you to pick up that L2, which is why he emphasizes the experience that we need to be using, or the teaching method, is a communicative approach that emphasizes input and output so that you're learning...
Is that the language that grows in your head?
You're speaking and you're hearing the second language in a social context.